Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas in the Rio Grande Valley of Deep South Texas. Joining us a little bit later in the program, our Salvador Rivera, our San Diego correspondent, is going to lead a conversation with the director of Proceso Pacifico, an organization that runs peace-building programs in Mexico and throughout South America, Mr. Ev Mead. So we're going to be looking forward to that conversation. He just returned from Culiacan, a place, as we've talked about here on the program, has seen a lot of violence in recent history. So looking forward to seeing the work that he's done there in Mexico and talking a little bit about everything that's been going on as of recent. That being said, we're going to start today's program by taking a look at what's trending across the border, starting with Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem testifying in the Senate today in her first congressional appearance since the shooting deaths of 2 American citizens in Minneapolis galvanized widespread opposition to how the Trump administration has been executing its mass deportation agenda. Noem's appearance in front of the Judiciary Committee also comes after this weekend's shooting at a bar in Austin, Texas, that is being investigated as a possible act of terrorism. Noem defended her agency's treatment of immigrants caught up in enforcement activities and blamed activists and others for attacks against officers. She also lashed out at Democrats for the congressional funding showdown and blamed the Biden administration for what she says is the failure of open borders.
Mr. Chairman, over the last administration, when millions of people streamed across our border, we don't necessarily know who all came into our country. We know that we have many dangerous individuals that came in unvetted, and we are working every single day to find them and to make sure that we're preventing the next attack and preventing the next crime they may perpetuate against the American people.
Noem faced questioning from Democrats who say officers under her control have abused their power, used excessive force, and violated people's constitutional rights in carrying the Trump administration's agenda. The Louisiana National Guard announced on Monday that 120 troops will remain deployed in New Orleans through August. The 6-month extension comes after 350 Guard members deployed to New Orleans in late December in the run-up to New Year's and other high-profile events like the Sugar Bowl. The troops, which had mainly clustered in the city's historic French Quarter, had been scheduled to depart in the aftermath of Mardi Gras. New Orleans is one of several Democrat-run cities, such as Washington and Memphis, Tennessee, where the federal government deployed armed troops under the administration of President Donald Trump. During his State of the Union address last week, Trump touted the deployment in New Orleans as a, quote, big success. While the airstrikes in Iran are more than 8,000 miles away from the state of Texas, the impact of the attacks has caused worries for travelers at the nation's southern border. Wait times at some international bridges and ports of entry have more than doubled. In El Paso, for example, motorists were waiting more than 2 hours to cross into the United States from Juarez. In Brownsville, here in South Texas, the usual wait's about 30 minutes. This morning, it was around an hour and a half. In San Diego, the wait times have been normal, which is anywhere from an hour to two hours to cross from Tijuana. Our Salvador Rivera asked U.S. Customs and Border Protection if security measures or patrols had been increased. A spokesperson said, just as it does every day, CBP is maintaining a comprehensive and agile security posture at all its ports of entry and will continue to keep our border and ports of entry secure. CBP is engaged with state and local law enforcement and intelligence partners to keep Americans safe, end quote. And speaking of our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, he joins us now with our guest for today's program. We've had him on the program several times before. Always a great conversation when he's on. The director of Proceso Pacifico, Ev Mead.
Thank you, Rudy. Ev, as you mentioned, he's a wealth of information, a wonderful conversation, a great person to talk to. Ev, I wanted to get into Proceso Pacifico. It's an organization that does a lot of great work in areas that have been impacted by violence, by cartels, places such as Sinaloa, the city of Culiacan specifically. This is a city that you know very well, but you had not been there in about 18 months. What prompted you to finally go back and talk about a little bit about the things that you did accomplish on your return visit just recently?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me. And yeah, so Culiacan is a place I've been worked since 2014, and I've run a certificate program there in applied peace education and in peace building with people from all different walks of life, everybody from police officers and government officials to university students, activists, business people. And since September 9th, 2024, Culiacan has been just completely locked down. They're living under a state of siege. And last spring, when we would have been starting our regular program where I go every other weekend and run workshops and an in-person program, we just couldn't do it. People told me that no one will come at night. Basically, after 6 p.m., nobody goes out anymore, and there are armed checkpoints all over the city, and people are just terrified. And so we ran an online-only program, which was okay, but I've been itching to get back. Finally got back last weekend, and it was bittersweet, I would say. On the one hand, it was really good to see old colleagues, to see some new students, to see, that there is a vibrant community there of people who want something different, who want to build a safer, more prosperous place to live. At the same time, they live under a state of siege and have for more than a year. I've never seen such an armed presence in the city. There are, Mexican soldiers, Marines, National Guardsmen, special forces, police, heavily armed all around the city. It's eerily quiet at night. If you know Sinaloa is a party place. This is a big Mediterranean kind of culture where people are going to give you a big hug and a kiss and, go to dinner late and talk loud and play loud music and be very hospitable. And it just doesn't have that feel right now. People are too scared and their lives have been too interrupted.
And what needs to happen? What programs would work in Mexico to bring this country back from decades of neglect, decades of violence, decades of cartels dominating the scene? What would you do? What social programs? What would you institute to get Mexico back on track?
Well, I mean, the one thing I was to say, it's not for lack of effort, and I don't think it's all because the current efforts are in bad faith. But I think we have learned some things, both within Mexico and in studying other armed conflicts and other places where organized crime holds sway, that there's some things that really work. And I would underscore 4 in particular. Number one, and this is probably the most important one, you've got to create civic spaces to address the problem of violence. So you got to get people from all different sectors of society together. They have to agree to kind of put the politics aside and collaborate on the problem of violence. And that might mean that you need to have, Chatham House rules when people are getting to know each other, where they don't, it's kind of a closed door thing. But then you got to have a public facing part of that. So in Culiacan, for example, we hosted a monthly security forum where everybody could come, hear the latest data on crime, and then discuss it. And we gave press conferences so the politicians would come, et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of stuff where you say this is above politics is really important. I think the second thing are violence interruption programs work. These programs where you send people out to the most affected communities and you have them help to resolve conflicts before they turn violent. They work. They work in Chicago, but they also work in Culiacan. Truth commissions and memory projects. I've been a part of a number of these. You've got to document the experience of living through this, but also document all the wonderful work that people are doing who receive no credit for it, who are sort of standing up and showing a rebellious humanity, even in the face of terrible violence. And there are lots of examples. And then finally, I would say we need policing that prioritizes protecting ordinary citizens over breaking up drug trafficking networks. And this means different things at different levels, but just very briefly, I would say it probably means getting local cops out of the drug war business so that people know when they call them, they're there to protect them. They're there to serve them. And if they encounter people from these armed groups, those people know they can just ignore them. They don't have anything to do with them because they're there to protect ordinary citizens. At the higher levels, like at the national level and the international level, we've got to prosecute people for acts of violence, not just for drug trafficking. And we need to be very careful not to give people impunity, in the form of immunity for terrible acts of violence just because they give information that helps to take down one of these capos. I think people are just tired of that. I mean, to give you an example, Damaso Lopez Serrano, El Mini Leak. This is a guy who got a 3-year prison sentence in the United States. He murdered one of Mexico's most prominent journalists, and he ordered the killing. It was a contract killing. It's the kind of thing that should have sent him to prison for life. Think about what it's like to be in his home community and see this guy responsible for, an act of terrorism, like a political murder of a very prominent person, get a 3-year sentence because he gave some information about other leaders of the cartel. It just feels wrong. It feels like it's wrong on values. And I think that at the national and international level, we need to get really serious about reducing and preventing violence. And that may mean changing some prosecutorial guidelines.
Talking about cartels and capos, a week ago Sunday, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación made a lot of news because its leader, Nemesio Ceguera El Mencho, was killed. Your take on his death and what happened in the aftermath? Some people described it as mayhem, violence, chaos, but you say it was a warning.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was mostly a display of power. You know, when you light a Costco on fire, burn some bank branches, sets up these fire blocks in Guadalajara, in Puerto Vallarta, but in 20 states all across Mexico, and does it more or less simultaneously. You have to think about that for a second, just step back and say, well, what are they really doing? Well, yes, they terrified everybody, but it wasn't a bloodbath, and it could have been. This was their way of saying, we can get you anywhere in the country, we can mobilize our men at the drop of a hat to do whatever we order them to do. But that was just the warning. That wasn't the actual violence. And I think that's something we've learned from, from the history in Sinaloa, the history of the Zetas on the other side of the country. And we need to pay very close attention to that warning.
We're speaking with Ev Mead, Director of Proceso Pacifico. We're going to continue the conversation after a very quick break. So stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. Joining myself and Salvador Rivera, our San Diego correspondent today, is the Director of Proceso Pacifico, Ev Mead.
Ev, a little while ago, we were talking about Proceso Pacifico, your mission in Culiacan. Why do you keep going back? A lot of people would have probably given up and said, I can't do this. This is beyond me. But what's your goal? Why do you keep going back and trying to make a difference over there?
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, one thing is, I've worked with some terrific people there, and, we're convinced that progress is possible. And if you look at Culiacan from the summer of 2017 until that fateful day, the 9th of September, 2024, the homicide rate fell by 50%. The rate of organized crime fell by 50%. I mean, the city was just way more livable. It just felt like things were getting better because they were. And I think we played a small role in that. So part of it's like we did have a recent history of success. And I think, so the question that, I think people really want to know is, yeah, but how do you do this? What does it mean to teach this stuff? What are you teaching? I mean, they're going to, the easy answer is, look, there is no recipe for peace here. Like if that were that easy, we just give you an outline and you go do that. Well, there'd be no reason to be there. But I do think there are a couple things that we can do collectively that make a big difference. So I would say there are three things that we do well. One is how to understand and study violence. Like people need to know where they can get good data. There's a lot of bad information out there. Like how do you get good data? How do you put it into context? And how do you differentiate between myths and things that go around in popular culture about violence and what the science tells us? So part of that is, that's just a good teaching function. The second one is more practical, and that's like, what are the conversational skills that you need, the active listening to be able to facilitate or lead a dialogue or mediate a dispute or negotiate between two disputing parties so that you can avoid violence in the first place. And they're really well-worn methodologies. They take a lot of practice. And a lot of time and a lot of patience, but they work. Conflict resolution works. And I think the last thing that we've gotten pretty good at over the last 10 years is, what do you do in the middle of violent conflict? Or what do you do after you learn about a terrible incident of violence? And I think there are basically just two things for us. One is we do some work on leadership in crisis. Like, what does it mean to lead? And you don't have to be the mayor or the president to lead. You can be leading your classroom or leading your department in a university or leading your business. And we talk a lot about servant leadership and exemplary leadership and what that means. And then we do a lot with trauma and memory. You have to recognize that these things have happened, share these stories, let people feel heard, but then also document what there's a Spanish philosopher, this guy, Juan Gutierrez, he calls them hebras de paz viva, or these strands of living peace. And that are these amazing little stories that happen within terrible environments of violence that show people maintaining their humanity, helping out somebody that they don't know, helping a person who's wounded, helping somebody hiding a supposed enemy, because you know that something terrible might happen to them. They're going to be tortured or executed. And there's just thousands of those examples that we find when we look. And so we try to structure programs where we can get at that. And the end goal is always the same. The end goal is you want a stronger participatory democracy where the losers in these conflicts are still part of society. Because what we can't do is come up with short-term solutions and say, oh, we'll lock them all up or kill them all. That doesn't work. You'd be talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of people in this particular case. That fantasy doesn't work in Mexico. You need that hard work of learning and studying the violence, mediating conflicts, coming up with nonviolent solutions, and then dealing with the aftermath of violence, treating people seriously.
So killing El Mencho and everybody else will not make the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación go away. That's what you're saying.
I mean, in the short run, that specific organization might go away, but what we're likely to see is fragmentation. And when we see fragmentation, we see these groups break up into a whole bunch of different armed groups, you tend to get much more violence. I mean, think about like an experience close to home for us with the Arellano Felix cartel, the Tijuana cartel. That was one of the great successes for the DEA, taking down that organization, arresting all the brothers and really, dismantling their network. Well, what was it like in Tijuana 10 years later? It was way more violent than it had been in the worst days of the Arellano Felix. And it's not to say they're not bad guys. It's not to say they don't belong in prison. These people are responsible for horrible acts of violence and all kinds of crimes. But we do have to ask ourselves, are things any better? And it's really hard to say yes right now to that. And I think so a shift in focus and how we prosecute these things and what we're really after is absolutely called for. And it's not a question of being less tough necessarily. It might be a question of just what's the priorities? What's the thing we're trying to stop? And violence has never been the number one priority. And I think what's to lose in prioritizing violence rather than prioritizing the networks themselves?
Mm-hmm. Speaking of saying yes or no, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum apparently has a hard time saying no to President Trump. Is she being blackmailed into actually cracking down on the violence, or is this something that is born from her administration?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, first of all, I think the hugs not bullets, the abrazos no balazos thing, people really kind of latched onto that. I would say in practice, the difference in the change in party in Mexico and the law enforcement strategy was not all that great. Her predecessor created a whole new military force, the Guardia Nacional. So I'm a little bit, it would be hard to say that they're not pursuing a military strategy against cartels. It's everywhere. So that I think is a little bit exaggerated. I also think that, the collaboration on things like the extraditions, extraditions 15 years ago were for cases that were 10 years old, and they sort of slogged through the courts. Now they're arresting these guys and doing it more or less immediately to the United States. So, and that's, so in other words, that's not Sheinbaum, that's not Trump. That's something that's evolved in the law enforcement community over a long period of time. I do think she's under a lot of pressure from Trump, and I do think Trump wants these big showy things. That's kind of how he operates in other areas of foreign policy as well. But I don't know, it's a competitive political environment, and there is some evidence that some folks in her party were probably collaborating with the Sinaloa cartel. I think that I don't think that's a big revelation. The question, though, for those things is always to what degree were they forced into impossible moral choices? And we don't know the answer to that. We really don't know the answer to that, because sometimes, it's were they collaborating, or were they making a decision that's saying, look, this group is worse than this group. We need to prioritize here. And in a way, maybe that lets this group a little bit off the hook, but we have limited resources and we have to prioritize. Or is it something much worse? We don't know the answer to that. And I think, I don't want to speculate on that, but I do want to say that she is in an incredibly difficult position. And in terms of getting what the U.S. has asked her for, it would be hard pressed to say she hasn't done it. What comes next, I think, is a big question, because I think if the U.S. presses her to do something like what's happened in El Salvador, I think that would be a terrible mistake in Mexico. This is not, these are not street gangs. These are multi-billion-dollar businesses with armies that can hire street gangs to do low-level work. This is a much, much larger, more complex enterprise. And we're talking about organized crime in Mexico that's involved in the gasoline business, the real estate business, retail, finances, money laundering, deeply involved in politics in some states. This is a really different problem. And to pretend like, if we just go for mano dura, some kind of iron-fisted policy, that it would work in the short run, I think it is a fantasy. And if we push her into something like that, I think it would be a terrible mistake. I think we should recognize the successes, but then again, you got to work towards changing those prosecutorial priorities. If the view from Mexico is, look, the U.S. wants these capos, and they're willing to let everybody else off if they get them. They're willing to let these guys who've murdered dozens of people walk scot-free or get some minor drug trafficking charge if they give the slightest bit of useful information. That's the view from Mexico. Think about the position that puts us in as a country, and think about how we must look through those eyes to people who are living through this kind of horrific violence. We need people in civil society to be our partners, not our enemies. We have enough enemies. So I think we need something a lot more collaborative, but I don't think we're necessarily that far off either.
For a long time, people in Mexico resisted U.S. armed forces, a presence of American forces in Mexico. Sheinbaum just said yes to Navy SEALs, U.S. Army Special Forces. How is that playing? And is this a sign that we're going to keep seeing more training, more operations to take down these cartels?
It puts me in a difficult position because I'm suspicious of the militarization of the thing sort of from the beginning. So I don't think that making that more extreme, I don't think there's much of a great track record there. The other practical reality is they've probably been collaborating a lot more than we know about publicly. There's a lot of evidence that in the arrests of El Chapo, for example, and things going back even 10 years, that American special operators have been involved without any public acknowledgement in lots of drug enforcement operations in Mexico. So, I would be pretty neutral on that. But I think if that's the only solution, it's not likely to work because, again, they can be very lethal and effective and take down particular guys. But if that just leaves us with more fragmentation and more armed groups, I'm not sure it's a great success.
We've been speaking with Ev Mead, director of Proceso Pacifico, about a whole wide range of topics regarding the violence that's happening in Mexico. Unfortunately, we are out of time, Ev, but we appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Rudy, and thanks very much, Sal, for all your work.
All right. Well, stay with us. Got a few more headlines when we return. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, your host here in Harlingen, Texas. Got a few more headlines to get out to you before we take off for the day. A judge is temporarily suspending the latest version of a Trump administration policy that requires members of Congress to provide a week's notice before they can visit immigration detention facilities. U.S. District Judge Gia Cobb in Washington ruled Monday that a group of Democratic lawmakers is likely to succeed in showing the 7-day notice requirement is illegal. 13 House members sued to challenge a January policy issued by DHS Secretary Noem. The judge says the Republican administration hasn't cited any, quote, concrete examples of safety issues posed by congressional visits without advance notice, end quote. Noem secretly reinstated a notice requirement 1 day after an immigration officer shot and killed a U.S. citizen in Minneapolis. A law bars the government from using appropriated general funds to prevent members of Congress from entering DHS facilities for oversight purposes. Republican Congressman Tony Gonzalez of El Paso, Texas, is seeking to fend off a primary challenge that comes as he faces calls to resign over allegations of having an affair with an aide. The three-term congressman is in a rematch against Brendan Herrera, a gun manufacturer who narrowly lost to Gonzalez in the 2024 primaries. Gonzalez entered the nation's first big primary of 2026 under pressure from fellow House Republicans after published reports last month that alleged to show explicit text messages between him and the former staffer. That staffer later took her own life. Across the state of Texas, voters are casting ballots to settle the first U.S. Senate primaries of the midterm election year. Republican U.S. Senator John Cornyn's trying to hold on for a fifth term as he faces Attorney General Ken Paxton, who's also accused of having extramarital affairs. The third candidate in this race is Congressman Wesley Hunt. On the Democratic ticket, Congressman Jasmine Crockett is up against state lawmaker James Tallarico. That contest is expected to go to a May runoff. Democrats haven't won a statewide race in Texas in over 30 years. Really quick, just wanted to remind you that you can stay informed on the stories shaping the U.S.-Mexico border in podcast form. We're bringing you real-time updates, expert insights, and voices from both sides of the border on those apps you see at the bottom of your screen. Thanks again to Ev Mead, Proceso Pacifico, for joining us today. For San Diego correspondent Salvador Rivera, I'm Rudy Mireles here in Harlingen. We'll see you next time.